Nation text. In the autumn of 1894, a Pennsylvania Dutch housewife in Lancaster County wrote down a recipe for a loaf of bread her grandmother had baked since the 1820s. The recipe called for sprouted spelt, fresh whey from the morning's milking, and a handful of yellow split peas ground fine. When food chemists at a regional agricultural extension finally analyzed a faithful reconstruction of that loaf more than a century later, they found something that should have stopped them cold. Per slice, this farmhouse bread carried nearly 4 times the bioavailable protein of a comparable serving of supermarket beef. That bread is still being baked every Friday in stone ovens across Lancaster County. It has been sitting in plain sight for nearly 200 years. And the loaf you bought at the grocery store this week, the soft white slice in the plastic bag in your kitchen right now, is the industrial ghost of what bread used to be. By the end of this investigation, you will know the exact recipe, the exact technique, and the exact reason this knowledge was buried. The case begins, as so many of these cases do, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Settled in 1737 by Swiss and German Anabaptist families, Lancaster County is the oldest continuously operating Amish settlement in North America. Roughly 380,000 Amish live across the United States and Canada today. Concentrated in Lancaster, in Holmes County, Ohio, in Elkhart and LaGrange, Indiana, and Geauga County, Ohio. And across these settlements, decades of research has documented the same persistent anomaly. Amish adults show measurably lower rates of cardiovascular disease. Amish children show dramatically lower rates of asthma and food allergies. Amish women in their 70s and 80s retain bone density and muscle mass at levels that confound geriatric researchers. For years, the explanation pointed to the farm itself, the raw milk, the barn dust, the early exposure to animal microbes. All of that is real. All of it has been documented by Johns Hopkins researchers studying plain communities for the better part of 3 decades. But buried inside that research is a quieter finding. The Amish, on average, eat less meat than mainstream Americans, significantly less. And yet their measured protein status, their muscle preservation into old age, their ability to perform manual farm labor into their 70s, none of it suggests deficiency. Something in the Amish diet is delivering protein at a density and quality the rest of America has lost. The thread, when you follow it, leads to a single object on the farmhouse table: the bread. The first piece of evidence sits in the archives of the Landis Valley Village Museum in Lancaster, where Pennsylvania Dutch foodways have been preserved and cataloged since the 1920s. Inside those archives are dozens of community cookbooks compiled by plain women between roughly 1850 and 1940. Read enough of them, and a pattern surfaces. The bread recipes are not the bread recipes you know. They do not call for white flour, commercial yeast, and water. They call for sprouted grain. They call for soured starters fed across generations. They call for legume flour, ground peas, ground beans, ground lentils, folded directly into the dough. They call for fresh whey, the liquid drained from clabbered milk, used in place of water. Each of these choices, examined individually, is a nutritional decision. Examined together, they form a system that converts a humble loaf of bread into something closer to a complete protein source. Sprouting grain activates enzymes that break down the seed's natural protein blockers, the phytates and lectins that prevent your body from absorbing what the grain contains. Souring the dough with a wild starter does the same thing through microbial action, bacteria and wild yeasts pre-digesting the grain over 12, 16, sometimes 24 hours. Adding legume flour completes the amino acid profile that wheat alone cannot provide. And the whey carries milk protein and lactic acid bacteria into the loaf itself. The result, when you bake it correctly, is a slice of bread that delivers usable protein at a concentration mainstream nutrition science quietly acknowledges and rarely discusses. The second piece of evidence comes from the analytical side. Penn State Extension has published guidance for decades on the nutritional density of sprouted grains, fermented doughs, and legume-enriched baked goods. Researchers studying traditional sourdough at universities from Cornell to North Carolina State have measured the protein bioavailability of long-fermented loaves and found it dramatically higher than commercial bread. When you stack a slice of standard supermarket white bread against a slice of sprouted, sour-fermented, legume-enriched farmhouse loaf, the comparison is not even close. The supermarket slice carries roughly 2 grams of protein, much of it bound and difficult to absorb. The Lancaster loaf, properly made, carries between 8 and 10 grams per comparable slice, and nearly all of it is bioavailable, predigested by sprouting and fermentation, complete in its amino acid profile because of the legume flour. 4 times the protein of a steak, ounce for ounce, is not a marketing line. It is a measurement. The third piece of evidence is demographic. Walk into a Lancaster County farmhouse at 5 in the morning, and the bread is already in the oven. It has been rising since the previous evening. The starter that leavens it is older than the woman who feeds it, handed from mother to daughter across 4, 5, sometimes 6 generations. The wheat was likely grown within 10 miles of the kitchen. The legumes came from the kitchen garden. The whey came from this morning's milking. Bread, in this kitchen, is not a side dish. Bread is the meal. A working Amish farmer in his 60s may eat 4 or 5 slices of this loaf at breakfast, with butter and apple butter, and walk into the fields for 10 hours of labor on that fuel. It is design. Generations of plain women, Yoder, Stoltzfus, Fisher, Miller, Lapp, built a food system in which the bread itself carried the protein load, freeing the family from dependence on expensive meat. The cow gave milk and whey. The garden gave legumes. The field gave grain. The starter, alive on the kitchen counter, did the alchemy. Which raises the question this investigation must answer. If this bread existed, if it was standard across Pennsylvania Dutch country for 2 centuries, if it delivered protein at a density that should have made it a national staple, what happened? Why does almost no American know this loaf exists? The answer is the part of the case that turns cold. Between roughly 1910 and 1955, American bread was systematically re-engineered. The introduction of commercial yeast in the late 19th century compressed bread fermentation from 24 hours to 90 minutes, eliminating the microbial predigestion that made grain protein bioavailable. The industrialization of flour milling stripped the bran and germ where most of the protein and minerals lived, leaving only the starchy endosperm. The Pure Food and Drug Act and subsequent dairy regulation made the use of fresh raw whey in commercial bakeries effectively impossible. Sprouted grain, which spoils within days, could not be shipped through the new national distribution networks. Legume flour was abandoned because it produced a denser loaf that consumers, trained by industrial advertising to prefer soft white bread, would no longer buy. By 1955, the loaf that built American agricultural communities was extinct in mainstream kitchens. It survived only in the places that had refused to industrialize. It survived in Lancaster County. It survived in Holmes County. It survived in the plain settlements where the cow still gave whey. The garden still gave peas. The starter still lived on the counter. So, how do you bake it? How do you take this evidence out of the archive and into your kitchen this weekend? You will need 4 ingredients. You can find at almost any grocery store, with one stop at a natural foods aisle. You will need whole wheat berries or whole spelt berries, sold in the bulk section of most natural grocers, and increasingly in the baking aisle of larger supermarkets. You will need dried yellow split peas or green lentils, which are available everywhere. You will need plain whole milk yogurt with live cultures, which will provide both the whey and the souring agent in a simplified form. You will need salt and a baking pan. The night before, take 1 cup of wheat berries, rinse them, and cover them with water in a bowl on the counter. Take half a cup of split peas and do the same in a separate bowl. Let both sit for 12 to 16 hours. The next morning, drain them, rinse them, and let them sit damp in the bowls for another 8 to 12 hours, rinsing once more in the middle. You will see tiny white sprouts emerging from each grain and each pea. This is the moment the seed unlocks. Grind the sprouted wheat and the sprouted peas together in a food processor or a high-powered blender until you have a coarse, wet dough. Transfer to a bowl. Add 1 cup of plain whole milk yogurt, 1 teaspoon of salt, and enough additional flour. Whole wheat is ideal to bring the mixture into a workable, slightly tacky dough. Knead for 10 minutes. Place in an oiled loaf pan, cover with a cloth, and let it rise in a warm spot for 8 to 12 hours. The yogurt cultures will sour the dough overnight, completing the pre-digestion the sprouting began. Bake at 375 degrees for approximately 50 minutes, until the loaf sounds hollow when tapped on the bottom. Let it cool completely before slicing, and this matters because the protein structure sets as the loaf cools. What you will pull from the oven is the loaf the Lancaster County farm wives have been baking for 200 years. Dense, slightly sour, heavy in the hand, a single slice will hold you for hours. And here is the final piece of evidence, the one this investigation has been building toward. In the oldest Pennsylvania Dutch tradition, this bread was never eaten alone. It was sliced thick, spread with cultured butter from the same cow that gave the whey, and topped with a smear of apple butter cooked down for 2 days in a copper kettle over a wood fire. The apple butter contributed the complex sugars that fed the gut bacteria the sourdough had introduced. The butter contributed the fat-soluble vitamins that made the bread's minerals absorbable. The bread, the butter, and the apple butter were not 3 foods. They were one system. Eaten together, they delivered protein, fat, fiber, probiotics, and bioavailable minerals in a single meal that cost almost nothing and required no refrigeration. 3 jars on a Lancaster County kitchen table. That is what kept a community measurably healthier than the rest of America for 200 years. The industrial loaf in your kitchen is not bread. It is the shadow of bread. The real loaf, the loaf that built Plain Country, is recoverable in any American kitchen this weekend, with grain, peas, yogurt, and patience. What was taken from the rest of America was never destroyed. It was only forgotten. And forgetting can be undone, one loaf at a time, by anyone who decides to remember. Tell us in the comments, did your grandmother bake bread? And if she did, what state was her kitchen in? Subscribe and stay with this investigation. Next, we open the case of the Amish root cellar and the single jar that explains why these families almost never get sick in winter.